We had two amazing talks, and two talks that were quite comprehensive, which leaves me in the difficult situation that most of the questions I had prepared were already addressed. Let me just start by giving a little bit of a summary. Bishop Frank talked about, well, both speakers talked about crises of inclusion, but from very different angles. Bishop Frank talked about a crisis of how we understand who we are and the meaning of life as, beings created in the image of God and as members of humanity redeemed by Christ. This amounts to a crisis of solidarity, a crisis of communion, a crisis of fraternity, very much reflecting Pope Francis's concerns. Professor Deaton talked about a global health crisis in which the advanced economies play an important role, and an emerging domestic health crisis, or a recent domestic health crisis, that's ended over a century of progress on the health front. Potentially these crises reflect perhaps deeper social and spiritual crises, as Professor Deaton indicated. So in many ways, the talks, we have a Scottish-born economist who's not a Catholic, and we have a Brooklyn-born Catholic bishop who's not an economist. So they reflect the pluralism in our society. But I wonder if I might ask you, and I'd ask Bishop Frank first, do you find any common ground in the material that was presented by Angus? And Angus, do you find common ground in the material presented by Bishop Frank?
Well, yes, quite clearly. I think Professor's presentation allowed us to go into the challenge of getting into the application of what I was attempting to present. And it's in the lived detail, in the application of the premises we operate out of, that you could see the inequality, and your presentation was magnificent because it's there, it's undeniable, it's just simply there. So then the question becomes is how do we respond to it? So I think, yes, absolutely, there was a complementarity.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I mean, for me, it's fascinating because, I don't usually hang out in Catholic circles, let alone do I get the opportunity to listen to a bishop like Bishop Frank. But for me, a lot of the words are words not that I would have used, but that I'm very happy to attach to things I'm talking about. Like the three terms, dignity, solidarity, and subsidiarity, for instance. I think dignity is really being violated here, and that many people have been deprived of that, and that depriving them of dignity has all sorts of knock-on effects in their family lives, which cause further destruction along the way. The solidarity, I think, is too obvious to talk about. I was fascinated by the subsidiarity term, because that, to me, I think, if you think of development, there's certain things that people in their own countries and their own communities are responsible for, and if they don't take that responsibility, it's not possible for us to do it from the outside somehow. So that delineating what are these things that we can do. So I think the principle of subsidiarity might be very helpful in thinking about, what sort of things we should be trying to help with and what sort of things we really can't try to help with, or if we try to help with, will likely do more harm.
Thank you. Pope Francis, in his call for inclusion, has emphasized, the economic side of inclusion and exclusion. No to an economy of exclusion, he wrote in Evangelii Gaudium. And you both touched on economic inequality. I think most of the idea was that economic inequality is a cause. I wonder to what extent it's a symptom of the crises that you emphasized. To what extent do the crises that you highlighted drive economic inequalities?
Maybe I could start on that. Inequality is sometimes very helpful to think about and sometimes not very helpful, just because it's complicated. I mean, you can have a situation in which inequality is rising, but good things are happening. And you can have a situation because, if say you gave aid to one country and, that was where you started, and the kids all did very well and didn't die anymore, you'd be generating a lot of inequality. And that's not a source of objection in itself. My friend Philippe Aghion writes about a form of capitalism called creative destruction, which was first thought of by Schumpeter, for instance. And that's a good indication of how inequality is good and bad, because you get some innovators who come along. Think of Jeff Bezos, for instance. And he does a lot of stuff which helps a lot of people. So things work better than they worked before. And, during the pandemic, we became to realize just how much we relied on Amazon. Our pandemic world would have been much worse without Jeff Bezos. On the other hand, that generated an enormous amount of inequality. Now, that inequality can then be used for bad purposes, to deny full dignity to everybody else. And so there's a sort of cycle of this thing. It's sometimes good, but then it can flip the other way. So I mentioned, I think, Elizabeth Anderson's work before. I think inequalities become bad when they threaten the dignity of each individual. I'm trying to use Bishop Frank's words here, but
You're doing great.
thanks. I'll believe that when you invite me to come and give a sermon.
I know people who would welcome that.
But so, if you think of wealth inequality like it used to be in Britain when there was an aristocracy and everybody else was serfs, that's a terrible thing. And it's not a terrible thing because they have a lot of wealth. It's a terrible thing because it sets a form of social relations which do not permit full inclusion of everybody, right? So that's when inequality gets to be really bad. So, Google used to say, we will never lobby. We don't need government. We'll just reshape the world by ourselves. Who do you think is the largest corporate lobbyist in Washington today? Is Google. They spend more than all the unions put together, right? So that's a situation when you start off with something good, then in order to preserve its position is undermining other people. And we have to have better institutions that stop that somehow.
Let me note on this a nuance from Catholic social teaching, which is that Pope Francis is, in the English translations, the word is inequality that he uses. But if you look at the Spanish, the word is actually inequidad, which is inequity. Inequity has a different connotation than inequality that might reflect some of what Angus has spoken of. Bishop Caggiano.
What I would add is just simply this. I think if you look at this room and you see the diversity of ourselves and our different gifts and talents, I do not think that the issue is that we would all have equality of resources and income and opportunity because we are diverse. But there is a basic threshold that no one should fall under. And when there are obstacles and structures in society that prevent the temporary inequality, allow the temporary to become permanent, is where we need now to address. And I must confess, from my perspective, and again, not being an economist, not being a social scientist, but a pastor, I think everyone operates with undefined definitions of basic questions, such as what is human dignity? What does it look like? And what is a human person to begin with? And what is a community? What constitutes a community? And we operate without ever asking ourselves the question and forcing ourselves to articulate an answer. And therefore, you could be in a room with all good intended people and not come to any path forward because we haven't gone deeper. So I think the contribution of Pope Francis is he's just asking us to go to the deeper level and ask the more fundamental questions, because then we would need strategies to address it. But there is the two-class society that Professor illustrated so clearly should be disturbing to anybody of right mind and goodwill, regardless of religious tradition. It's just unacceptable. And the Pope sees that clearly because he has a global vision, and it's within countries and among countries. So I believe this is the moment for us to kind of both look at the fundamental questions and the tactics and the largest economic and societal structures to address it. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the global vision. So Pope Francis, also wrote Fratelli Tutti and Laudato Si, both being reminders that we are all part of a, quote, single family dwelling in a common home. All brothers and sisters called to communion, as Bishop Frank has mentioned. So the call to conclusion has this global dimension. Bishop Frank, you're the chair of the board at Catholic Relief Services. How can the church and private charity best promote the integral human development of peoples across the world? And what are the limits of this and of civil society in general?
Well, I would say this. I think, first, for me, it's a great privilege to be on the board of CRS because it's the humanitarian agency sponsored by the bishops to address, some of these issues that we are facing. It's in 115 countries, has 6,700 employees and a budget of $1.2 billion. But CRS is committed to structure and structural change, not necessarily to relief and aid. And it partners with local countries, particularly local Episcopal conferences, to be of assistance to local leaders as they strive to create structural change. So it's all about sustainability of life. Now, I'm not exactly sure in the end for the different regions that CRS is in, what the results have been over the long term. My sense is that it has yielded tremendous fruit. But again, it's just one aspect of how the church is a communion that is global. And I challenge the people of my own diocese. Fairfield County is one of the richest, if not the richest counties in the country, and one of the largest wealth disparity in the whole country. And I constantly challenge our people to see ourselves as a global communion. So the suffering in Ethiopia is as much a concern for us as the suffering that may be in your own home, right? And therefore, I think CRS is committed to the extent possible, partnering with local to empower local leaders to address the situation for themselves, similar to what I think Professor was trying to say, rather than parachute in, give aid, and parachute out. That is not what CRS does, except in moments of crisis, earthquakes, hurricane, things of that nature.
COVID, I hope.
Or COVID, for that matter, with vaccines, which CRS is very much involved with trying to distribute vaccine to individuals, right, in areas where some vaccination rates are as low as 3% of the population in Africa.
Angus, much of your work is in international development. You've worked closely with the World Bank and other international organizations. You mentioned that you're skeptical about foreign aid. What ought these organizations to be doing to better promote economic development, inclusive growth? Are they doing what they should be doing?
I doubt it. I'm not a great fan. I mean, the IMF has changed a lot. And I think one of the sad things about the recent scandal, which many of you may have read about Christiana Georgieva, her position has been, and she's changed that institution quite radically. And I think there's still internal battles going on with the IMF. I mean, their response to bad times is to make them even worse. The recipe for austerity and all the rest of it, which I think has not worked in the past. And I think the IMF is beginning to realize that, and she's on the right side of that. And so that may bring real change. I think the World Bank is you see, I have a vision for the World Bank, which is the World Bank ought to be a provider of global public goods. And that it has got an enormous amount of expertise from working around the world. So it ought to be a sort of management consultant, if you like, on which countries around the world can draw. Right now, it's basically an agent of the US government or the US government, though there's, of course, this battle going on between the US government and China, which will take many years to resolve but I mean, it's too close to being an instrument of US foreign policy there are banks like the Andean Development Bank, I think, which are much more like a mutual aid organization between the countries. They don't take money from the outside, they sort of insure each other. And so I think that model would be a much better model for the World Bank. But the thing that is really disturbing is if you look at the budgets of African countries, those budgets are dominated by foreign aid, right? And that means that the governments in those countries have no incentive whatsoever to respond to their people. And it's incentivizing those governments to be exploitive regimes against their own people. And that is what aid has wrought. And it's not one aid agency, it's this sort of collective of aid agency. And it's a very hard problem to solve because you can get the Brits who say, okay, we'll pull back, but then the Japanese will step in or the Chinese will step in and so on. So, but I think it's been very, very destructive for Africa.
May I just also add an observation? And this is very personal, so forgive me, but being an Italian American born here in the United States, but one of the few in my family who was actually born in the United States, I often went back to Italy to visit my grandparents. And it is amazing over the last 45 years how the economic reach of the United States into a small village of 2,600 people in the middle of Campania, sitting on a mountain, has transformed the entire social fabric of the village. Where it was family-based, where it was much more a local community, you could see the fiber literally disappearing. Because with the economic reach comes all the social values that animates American society. And it's doing a colossal harm. So forgive me again for being, there's a myopic vision that we have sometimes as a country that we're the force of good, and we don't realize that sometimes we are bringing really destructive forces, totally unreflectively, in the very fabric that we would need to rebuild a structure that would allow for true equality, right? And I just reflect on it in my own life, and you could just see it in living color of what that is.
Probably a lot fewer children die there now than did when your grandparents were born.
Yes, yes.
So it's not all bad.
No, but you know what, Professor? In the village, the almost all the young people are gone. They're all gone because they've moved up north for where there's economic opportunity. Right?
Angus, you attributed more of the disparities that you were seeing to technology than to globalization. Both obviously influence the economy, both influence the culture. Can you explain a little bit more about where you think the two lie in this field, and then after that, Bishop Caggiano and the
I a little worry that China is an easy target. They have their own problems, and I don't think the Trump administration did us a great service by demonizing China, which seems to have survived beyond his presidency. I mean, if you look at the data on American manufacturing has not declined. Most people think, China took away American manufacturing. It's not true. The output of American manufacturing has continued to grow. What has happened is there are no jobs anymore because of automation. So if you have to choose between robots and China, I'm not saying that China didn't do any harm. And, the work that David Otter and other people have done showing the China shock, but those were very focused in particular places. And I think most of us think that automation has been a much larger thing. The trouble is, you might say automation is inevitable. It's making us all rich because it's good to have productivity increases. There are two problems to that argument. One is we're subsidizing companies to automate by giving grants for accelerated depreciation, the tax treatment of that sort of thing. The second thing is the healthcare system is encouraging automation too, because if you put a robot in place of a guy, you don't have to pay $20,000 a year for health insurance for him or her. So, we've got to get our healthcare system under control because that's one of the huge engines of upward redistribution, that a huge amount of money is going up to already pretty wealthy people. And you saw the graph I showed at the beginning. I mean, our life expectancy is going the wrong way. So our healthcare system, which at its best is obviously the best healthcare system in the world, is eating us alive.
From my perspective, technology poses a visceral threat to any possibility of reestablishing a wide-scale, wholesale philosophy, a way of life that respects human dignity. And that's a mouthful to say, but I say it for this reason. If the turn to the subject has come to its logical conclusion in the West, where we consider ourselves to be the standard of truth, standard of morality, standard of ethics, technology actually in social media allows us to take the last factor, which is community, and create it in our own image. So online, I don't need, a local community is not a geographical reality where I have to deal with the good, the bad, and the ugly, the people I like and don't like. I now create community of people of like mind who look like me, talk like me, believe what I believe, and we become not a community, but a tribe. And in its worst possible form, goes to war with other tribes. And that is, unfortunately, what you see some in social media. Now, I'm not condemning that. I'm just simply stating that tendency isolates the individual. Now, when you speak of a community then that is inclusive, not divisive, how do you get back to that? And quite frankly, if you allow me just 10 more seconds, the last slide the professor put on the graph, let me ask an existential question. Why would anyone who is in that 2/3 block, why would anyone in that block feel the need, feel compelled to address those who do not have the same thing they have? What is the rational, humanitarian, moral argument to be made to say, you know what, we have to change this?
There is fear.
I'm sorry?
There's fear. There's fear of the pitchforks. There's fear of Donald Trump. And I think that will do. Also, I'm generally in favor of technology, but if I had my druthers, I'd close down Facebook and Instagram and all the rest of it.
So, Bishop Frank, you mentioned that being able to disagree is important.
Oh, without a doubt.
So I want to give you each a chance to push back. Either, if you think there's some element of Pope Francis' call that reflects naivety or overlooks something, or something about each other's presentation that sort of missed something, I'm going to give you a chance to argue here.
I pass.
Hey, that's cheating. You said this was necessary.
Well, I don't, I think, disagree. And I've always found Pope Francis's writings inspirational. Even if I do believe in the power of markets for good, as well as the power of markets for evil, which you've seen here too. But for instance, I do find, I think it would be extremely helpful, for instance, if the Catholic Church would endorse carbon pricing, take an example. So I understand some of the arguments against it, but I think that would just help enormously to guarantee the future in a way that no single other thing really would. And I think Pope Francis' opposition to that has, in my view, not been helpful.
Allow me to answer the question this way. There is nothing the professor's presentation I would disagree with at all. I think it just gave meat and content and structure to what I was trying to say, or at least summarizing what the Pope said. I think if I were to critique, it's the life of the church I would critique, because the church is fracturing. It reflects the political fracturing even here in the United States. So we don't speak with a common voice, because everything that the Pope is suggesting we do in the common sphere, in the public sphere, we also have to do within our own church. And we're having difficulty doing that. So when we speak of dialogue, I don't see a lot of dialogue, that people are hardening their positions. And most of the time that happens because they're only looking at half-truths or false choices and not looking at the larger picture. So I think, Professor, to your point, the church doesn't speak with a common voice. That's our immediate task, is to apply what we're talking about for the larger context within our own ecclesial life. And that will be difficult to do, but it has to be done.
So that's something I've learned by coming here, and I knew it, but to hear it from you is quite extraordinary. And I mean, it's these divisions that seems to be with all of us that has even split the church in that way. And that's a great tragedy.
Okay, the pleasant conversation is over. I'm going to take some questions from the audience. One source of division in society, the Pope calls to not be shy of discussions. How do you put this in a world of what is called political correctness or the absolute avoidance of microaggressions? In this sense, what should be more important, freedom of speech or the risk to be offended? Let me give that to the successor of the apostle
There
here.
you go. Well, the risk to be offended is a personal referent, right? I could say something to you and you may not be offended. I could say something to you, you'd be grossly offended, right? But it's the context from which you're hearing what I'm saying. You would not risk being offended if there was a common relationship we shared, if there was the ability to speak and listen to what is being said with the intent that is being said with. So I think in the end, the truth needs to be spoken, but it needs to be spoken in a way that is effective so that it can be heard. It is not a bludgeon to beat somebody over the head with. And that is, again, where the Pope is asking us to do that, but the Pope is not going to do that. It's the local leaders who will do that. Conversation this way, because the Pope is the global catechist, he's the global teacher of the faith. The translation occurs in the local level. So I think that is where we need to be honest with one another, but to speak effectively and empathetically the truth and listen to what is said back. And to listen to what is said back. And if we did that, I'm not sure many people would be offended by what is said.
Angus, you sit at an elite university where discourse is paramount. Do you want to address this question? Or?
I worry again about this being the political correctness and trigger warnings and all the rest of it being more a symptom of the failure of dialogue than a cause of it.
Failure of?
Of a failure of dialogue. I should say that, I mean, I don't teach anymore, but I taught in Princeton for 35 years, and I never met any of this. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but the idea that you can't speak the truth in your classroom because of an overwhelming political correctness or thing has not been a problem for me. I'm sure you'll find other people who have. I mean, obviously, you try not to insult your classes, but, you know, within the confines of recognizing the dignity of each of your pupils, I've never felt constrained in saying anything at all.
Angus, let me follow up with another question. You mentioned your belief in the positive aspects of markets. This question says, what would be the first thing you would change about our capitalistic system to reduce inequalities and achieve minimal outcome for all? The one thing, the first thing.
I think the deepest thing I would change is the campaign financing system, simply because it enlists our politicians who ought to be working for us to work for rich people. And they can't avoid it because they can't be elected unless they're raising money all the time. And I have no idea how we do that, since it seems ingrained in our Constitution that we can't do that. But I think it's this, you know, you get lobbying all around the world, but nothing on the scale that we see here. You know, I mean, the opioid crisis is a prime example where, you know, people in Congress interfered to stop the Drug Enforcement Agency closing down the distributors, basically because they were getting campaign contributions. So, you know, they were being paid to be accessories to murder. And, you know, once that's part of our political system, we're in really deep trouble. Those people are still in Congress.
Bishop Frank, I've been given the sign for 1 minute, so you have not too much time. You're not a policy expert, but obviously you have informed political views. if I address that question, feel free to also think about one thing in the church that you would change that might address these things, if that's more your expertise. Which one thing would you change to address inequalities or achieve minimal outcome for all, or maybe just inclusion more broadly?
I think, to repeat myself from before, I think it's the myopic vision that many believers have that has not allowed them to see the communal and global effects of the decisions that they make. We all kind of live in small little neighborhoods, small little worlds, but the very nature of the church is Catholic, which means it is universal. And to challenge people to see beyond that would be able to inform them in their professional lives to act differently and begin to change the structure. So it would be the individual behaviors of the individual believers. Within the church itself, I would want to banish, if I could, half-truths. Half-truths.
Which half?
Whichever half I don't agree with. No, I mean the half-truths. Because in the end, that is what's preventing the dialogue, when people refuse to see more than the piece they want to see.
It's a wonderful discussion. Unfortunately, we could go on for hours, I'm sure, but unfortunately, we've been told we have to end it.